because I draw the line.
Lamb chop. This is the song that doesn't end. It just goes on and on, my friend.
What is that?
Some people, some lamb chop.
No.
I beg to differ. We'll look at after Bible study. I'll prove you wrong. Some people started singing it, not knowing what it was, and they just kept on singing it forever just because it is the song that doesn't end. Yeah.
Stuck with you, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, it might be now. That might be a different edition of Lamb Chop. You know, because like a reboot, you know, series.
The cartoon version?
No, it was live, but it wasn't all.
Everything was live.
It wasn't, but
I
maybe
just remember
maybe 20 years ago though.
Lamb chop saying, I love you, Sherry.
Yeah,
I love
well,
you, Sherry.
Yeah. That lamb chop was cute.
It was a song.
It was a sock talking.
I know, but
You just had to
Hey,
go with it. And
it's
not
the
think
wonder.
about what it was.
It's the wonder of childhood.
I love the lamb chop.
Yeah.
I sign up for
Well, visiting nursing home residents,
I did, okay.
helping out the kitchen during special events,
Right.
cleanup crew member for a church event.
I've done that. Not recently, but
Oh goodness, Gail will do whatever you ask her to. She'll say no the first time, and then feel guilty on the way home.
I'm doing what I want to do, and because I want to do it so much. Our budget got increased to $1,000 last night.
Yes.
Finance committee, yeah.
Oh, well, good.
And I didn't even ask for it. And they said, Gail's mission committee. And I said, well, really, it's not mine. And they said, yeah, really.
No, we had the utmost confidence that it was not a waste of money, that it was a good investment.
Wait to
Yeah,
spend it.
yeah. I might have to move my January meeting up. So
I mean, that was just hammered into me as a young person in Bible school that the generosity of a church and the missions outlook of a church is the number one, symptom of a healthy church. When that goes, that's when the church starts to decline. When they start to think only about themselves, that's when it starts to die. So
We're doing real good now.
yes, we are.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
I wanted to
it
spend
would be
all.
nice if we could flip, our budget to outreach being the greater portion. That's a long time coming though. But
And
we'll see.
it is for a small church like this. It is amazing.
It's a little powerhouse, yeah.
Wonderful congregation.
Yes, we
They've
do.
never. They said, "Do you need any more money?" And I said, "No, not today, but I'll keep you in mind." And I write their name down.
Yeah,
That's wonderful.
that's good. All right, let's look at Leviticus 22.
I have one.
Leviticus 22, verses 13 is where we're going to start. If you remember last week, we went through the list of things that can't be wrong with the high priest. And do you remember how many there were? 12.
Okay.
12 exactly. All right. And it's like they nitpicked, in order to get to the number 12. Well, we're going to see the same thing happen today when they talk about acceptable sacrifices, acceptable offerings, these animals that are going to be presented. They say you can't have this or this, and when you look at all the ors in there, it just magically adds up to 12. And you have to understand that it's not that God is trying to pick on the differences so much as He's trying to point out this is a ritual holiness, and that number 12, is this calling of God, and 12 when it comes to Israel is a good number. But to remind you, this is not like hocus pocus numbers. It's not like 12's a lucky number. She'd only plant 12 tulips or something like that. That's just silliness. It's just understanding what God's talking about, what that number means. And it's just this fullness of God's plan. When God does it right, when God does it the way that he has planned it, it's going to be 12. And we see that all the way in the very end, the foundation of the new city, and the gates of the new city. There's 12 stones named for the apostles and for the tribes of Israel, and it's our pearls. And it's just this, him saying, no, I have done this, and I've my people, and that's what it's represent. That 12 represents that. It's not that 12's a magic number or anything like that. Like the number 3, when we see that in Scripture, don't think, oh, 3's good, and then shy away from the number 6. When the number 6 shows up in Scripture, he's trying to talk about something in particular. There's a reason for that. It's usually humanity and man-powered righteousness. Number 6. We were created on the 6th day. So the number 6 is man-powered righteousness. Why the number of the Antichrist is 666? Well, how many 6s is that? 3, which represents God, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's man trying to be God, right? And that's who he is, and I believe he's probably a real person, not a mythical thing and not just an image, but there's a reason that's his number, because that's what he's trying to do, and trying to lead us away from God to be our own gods, which would be our undoing, right? So these numbers, that's what we have to get our head around, not the hocus pocus of it all, just understanding what are you trying to say, God. So in verse, I got to put my glasses on to read this and pull this down so that I can not fog up. It says, but if a priest's daughter is widowed or divorced and has no child and returns to her father's house as in her youth, she may eat of her father's food, yet no lay person shall eat of it. Now this, remember we talked about, and we just mentioned it in the very beginning, or the very end of last week in verse 12, if you kick back up to that. The priest's daughter marries a layman. She shall not eat of the contribution of the holy things. And this was, that's loaded with implication there. But in a nutshell, way back in the beginning, it's just like a man shall leave his mother and a woman leave her home, and the two shall become one. And it's that image is much more important for us to understand than, we get lost in the details, sometimes. And the point here is, no, that's a picture of, believe it or not, that's a picture of impurity. Even though it's perfectly normal, it doesn't say she should be punished. It just means she can no longer come and eat the food of the priest because she is one with something that's not a priest. That makes sense? No? And it's a little abstract, but it's that idea of you, like even legally, if you leave, if you're saying, I'm no longer a part of this family, I'm a part of this family, and there's a separation that takes place there. I'm no longer my father's daughter. I'm now this man's wife. Now, if there's a divorce or he dies and you come back home, we see this grace sprinkled back in there. You come back home because you're no longer married to that which is not this, then you're welcomed right back in. And so we see this little picture of the gospel in which if we're devoted to the things of God, then we can participate in those things. But if we go after other things, then no, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And that's why we get hung up because, well, she's just a daughter. She's just getting married. That's perfectly normal. It is. That's why it's just a word picture. It's just an image for us to understand that separation. He doesn't call it sin. He just says, if this happens, do this. Now, why? You always have to ask the question, why? Why would he make that distinction? And he's trying to point out that, no, if you want to have your devotion be to someone else, then that's the way it's going to be. But if you want to have your devotion be here, then you can participate in the full life of God. Yes, ask your question.
No.
No?
It's silly.
What is?
okay, if I went and got married and left my mom and dad, but they welcome my husband into their home, when we all be family?
Well, yeah, that's why I was saying don't get caught up in the details of it, and also don't impute American Western culture on the scriptures either.
Oh,
It's
okay.
totally different. It doesn't mean, like, this person who married the priest's daughter, they wouldn't have been like, fine, we're mad at you for marrying our daughter. It was still a celebration, there was probably still a familiar bond there. But he's like, I want you to see what this represents. That if she's going to choose this, then she can't do this. And it's that, because when we look at all of these Levitical laws, if we get hung up in the details, we're going to be like, well, that's just not fair, or that just doesn't feel right. And we got to get past the emotional reaction and understand that he's trying to talk about something a little deeper than just this surface reading. And that there's a reason that priest's daughter can't eat of the holy things anymore. And it's because of what it represents. It's not because she's unclean. It's a ritual uncleanness. It's not a, ew, you went and got married. It's like you can't be here anymore. It's just a ritual uncleanness. It's what it represents. But if she is widowed or divorced and has no child, and that importance of she had no child, in other words, she didn't have a kid who would take care of her, because that was what was expected. The children would take care of their mother. To be a widow indeed would be you have no husband and you have no children and you're destitute. And in this culture, you really were, because you couldn't own property. You were property in most instances. And so you needed to come home in order to eat. Otherwise you were going. That's why the story of Ruth is so phenomenal, that Ruth chose to go home with Naomi, who had nothing. She's like, your people will be my people, your God will be my God. And they lived off of scraps left on the side of the field. That's what they were living off of. That's how destitute they were. So when Boaz marries her, it's like, wow. He didn't have to, but he chose her. Even though she was a Moabite, she was unclean, every sense of the word, she did not belong where she was. And yet she was redeemed, which is this beautiful picture of the gospel, right? So we see it all there, and we can get upset about the culture and the way it worked, but God's like, no, you watch me. I'm so good that I can even use this messed up culture to show you my son and show you how grace works. Okay? So if she's there, she may eat as in her youth. She may eat of her father's food. And that phrase, as in her youth, it's an important phrase. That happens all throughout the prophets, that phrase where God is beckoning Israel to come back to him when they have left him. And that's why this is an image of you leaving God. He's like, come back to me, follow me, worship me as you did in the days of your youth when I rescued you from Egypt. Boy, when you were in the desert and you needed me, you were at church on time. When you were in the desert and you needed me, you didn't fool around with those other gods. But now things are, nice and happy, you've forgotten my name. And so that's why those two little verses are in there for that purpose. And this hope of the gospel is just laced throughout these scriptures. Verse 14, and if anyone eats of a holy thing unintentionally, it's like an accident, he shall add the fifth of its value to it and give the holy thing to the priest. So if you're like, this was set apart for this, and I didn't mean to. It was an accident. We forgot to label it or whatever. Then you need to make reparations for that and then give it to them. And what you see there, and again, it seems unfair, right? It was an accident. We love to say it was an accident. If I hear that from my son 15 times a day, it was an accident. I didn't know. I forgot, And it's like, if you're going 100 miles an hour through a school zone and you get pulled over and you say, well, I didn't see the sign, guess what's happening to you? In other words, you should know. and they're saying, you've heard the law enough, you've been around enough, you should know. Okay, we're willing to understand it, but you're gonna pay a reparation there. They shall not profane the holy things, verse 15, of the people of Israel, which they contribute to the Lord, because it's set apart to who? The Lord, right? That's why I don't come down here in the morning and have cereal in the offering plate. That is set apart for collecting offerings, And you might, well, it's just a plate. No, that is set apart for this purpose. We don't do anything else with it. We don't play Frisbee with it. We don't play youth group games where we roll it around. We don't wear it as a hat. We don't goof off with it. It's set apart for this purpose. Now, do we believe that that's the only way we can collect offering? No. And that's what you have to understand about Scripture too. Once something has been set apart, that's what it needs to be used for. But once, something that hasn't been set apart is not off limits for God to use. God can use whoever and whatever He wants. He used a donkey to speak to Balaam. Right? And so there's nothing off limits for God to use. But once you dedicate something to God, leave it to God. And we like to take back, things that we've offered to God. How many commitments have we made to God that lasted for a time, for a season? Like, oh, yeah. Now, I'm one, I tend to overcommit. That's part of my problem. Like I think I've shared with you, the very first time I practiced Lent, I basically went vegan, which is like dumb for a fat guy. And I think by noon I'd already broken 3 or 4 of the things that I said I was going to give up. And, it's just like that guy Jephthah, he's like, the first thing that comes out of my house to greet me, I'm going to sacrifice to you, God. Didn't ask for that, So give what God asks. Don't give more, just because you're trying to impress Him. Yeah. Just give what God asks and leave it at that. Now, Jesus does in the New Testament. He takes a lot of these things in the Old Testament and He says, "You've heard this is the rule. I say this is the rule." He kind of ups the standard. For a lot of these, like you've heard it said that you can commit, you can get a divorce if your wife commits adultery. He's like, I'm telling you that you're committing adultery if you looked at another woman. So He's like, let's talk about the heart issues here. You should give 10%. He's like, I'm asking for all of it. It all belongs to me. So you ask me about every dollar you spend, and I'll tell you whether you can do it or not. Can you imagine living your life that way? Crazy, right? But imagine how well you would be living if you said, Jesus, just that simple prayer. Jesus, should I buy this taco or not? And if He says yes, buy the taco. And people, well, that's just impractical. Is it? Or is it just a nuisance? Is it impractical? Because if we can develop that prayer habit where we're just constantly, like Paul says, pray without ceasing, where just... And like my dad always said, it's God probably doesn't care what color shirt you're wearing today, but are you listening if He does? If He says, I want you to wear the orange shirt, will you obey? Or will you say, that's yesterday's pizza talking? And so to be that intimate with God, where you're in line for your hamburger or whatever, and He's like, no, get the chicken sandwich instead. You don't have to understand why. You just obey. And you spend your money on what He says to spend it on. But we always think, well, I've got this, I gave God His, and the rest is mine to do whatever I want. Well, yes, there's freedom there. There's grace. But what would life be like if you also took the 90% and said, what should I do with this? How should I use these gifts that you've given me? And He has wisdom for us every day, every time. And, anyway, that was free. No charge. Where are we at? They shall not profane the holy things. All right, verse 16. And so cause them to bear iniquity and guilt by eating their holy things. For I am the Lord who sanctifies them. And there's that phrase again. I am the one who sanctifies them. And what He's saying is when you when you break these rules, it's not, this helps me, deal with the rest of Leviticus, because, we've already read some rules that are like, that's really harsh, but he's saying this is not because, oh, you're disgusting. It is because it's what you're saying to me and about me when you disregard what I say to do. So it's almost like he's saying it's kind of like a personal offense to me when you act like these things don't matter and I told you they do. It doesn't matter if you understand. It doesn't matter if you like it. Just trust me. I'm the one who rescued you out of slavery. I'm the one who has provided for you. And so trust me when I say this is what you need to do. So verse 17. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his sons, so these are the high priests, and all the people of Israel, and say to them, when anyone of the house of Israel or of the sojourners in Israel, so this is like whether you're pure, 100% Jewish, or whether you're a visitor, okay, somebody who's a Gentile living in the house of Israel. When you come to present burnt offerings, that would include people like Ruth. That would include people like Rahab. She married into the tribe of Israel. And she was now expected to follow all of these ritual rules. Just because you're Gentile, you don't get a free pass. Okay? And so when they present burnt offerings as his offering for any of their vows or free will offerings that they offer up to the Lord, if it is to be accepted for you, it shall be a male without blemish of the bulls or the sheep or the goats. So you have to remember, this is, Christologically speaking, this sacrifice is meant to represent Jesus. And he's always pointing forward to his son. His son Jesus is going to be that perfect, without blemish. And with that without blemish, we understand that when it comes to Jesus, that doesn't mean that Jesus never had a pimple. It means that Jesus was without sin, that he was perfect, he was holy. And so when you see that without blemish, just from the get-go, wrap your mind around that this is ritual holiness. It speaks of something deeper. It's not because God hates animals with long limbs. It is because that represents some kind of imperfection. So it's what it represents. It's not, they didn't be like, oh, you should just take that out and kill it because it's worthless. No, it's a living creature. It deserves its dignity. If you're going to kill it because you're going to eat it. And so we have to disassociate ourselves from sort of these human reactions to these things. And so you don't offer, verse 20, you shall not offer anything that has a blemish, for it will not be acceptable for you. And when anyone offers a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, to fulfill a vow as a free will offering from the herd or from the flock to be accepted, it must be, I love that word, perfect. There shall be no blemish in it. So we'll get into this here real quick. But, when it comes to us as people, as humans, we have this bent toward trying to prove ourselves. I mean, we're just constantly, and it's not just a few of us, all of us, we have that bent of, we're thankful for the cross, we're thankful for the grace, but there's this little part of us that says, I'm good for it. When the awful truth is no, you're not. And you will come up short. You've already come up short, and you will come up short again. And so for you to rely on your own, that bootstrap theology is what we call it. For you to rely on your own righteousness to prove to God that you are worthy. Number one, it's offensive to the righteous one who died for us. But number two, it's like you're putting your hope in an animal that has a blemish. You're saying this is just as good as that one, and it's over here, it's all disfigured. Because spiritually, that's what we are. The scriptures, God says, your righteousness is like a dung heap, and it's like a pile of filthy rags. And you might think it smells good, but it stinks, because our motives, right? Our motives always get in the mix. It's like I can, in one act, say I'm giving a cup of cold water to a stranger. Isn't that what Jesus tells us to do? I can give a cup of cold water to a stranger, and in the very act of doing that, my heart motive can be all over the map. There might be a little part of me that's because I care about that person, and that's the good. That's the Jesus in you. Then there's like, I hope somebody sees me doing this, right? And just in case they didn't, hey, I gave a cup of cold water. It's like a man doing the dishes. He stands by the dishwasher until his wife notices, right? And it's just like, she's not happy that you did the dishes after that, because it's that whole notion of your heart motive. And he's like, the deed can look the same on the outside, but why we did it, in the end, why you do what you do determines what it becomes, whether it becomes gold or whether it becomes dung. That's a big difference. Gold or dung, which would you rather have? And every day we serve God up a pile of dung and say, you like this? And he's like, I'm really not interested in that. I don't eat that. Stop offering that. Offer me instead my son. Because that's what I want. I want you to put all of your eggs in that basket. And then when I look at you, we're like, wow, that's my daughter. That's my son. That's the one I'm really in love with, right there, with all of her imperfections. When we think, how could you love me? I smell like dung. He's like, no. You smell like my son. That myrrh that he was anointed with, right? Was poured over his head, and that's what he wants to smell. But when we go, he's like, whoo, that is not what I'm after. And it's that the aroma of Christ is what Paul calls it. We want the aroma of Christ. And that's that humility, that we walk in. And it's like, and if we are our own worst enemies, because when I'm walking in the Spirit, oh man, it is so good. And then I start to think, man, I'm good. And I'm like, oh, and it's like, why do we do this to ourselves? And I think as we learn and as we grow, we become less so. We think, if you read through Paul, at first glance, you're reading Paul's stuff and you think, man, he's kind of cocky. He thinks he knows everything. And I think maybe in the early days he probably was. But when you read some of his later writings, they're super humble. And so he learned and he grew. Peter in the Gospels was so full of himself. And then later on, my favorite was where Peter's like, man, Paul, when he talks, he uses all these big words that are hard to understand. I just try and keep it simple. And so it's just the humility that was worked into even the apostles over years of spending time with Christ. So we have to learn that, we're going to grow, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to think that when we are successful in Christ that it was all us. And he's like, no, I needed you to participate in that, but just never make the mistake of thinking that the power for that did not come from me. Never make the mistake of thinking that the grace was not through my son Jesus, that your righteousness is through Christ alone. And not, Paul, again, not by works, lest anyone should boast. Not by works, lest anyone should boast. Yet Paul was the first one to tell you, you better get busy, right? But not in order to earn God's favor, but to say thank you to God for what he's done. And that's why we do it. And if your motive for doing righteousness is to say thank you, I think that smells good to God. But if your motive for doing righteousness is to say, are we good? And then he's like, something's amiss. There's a dead mouse somewhere. I can smell it. Isn't that the worst? When you smell the dead mouse, but you can't find it? Yeah. So anyway, all right. Meditate on that. Don't get a self-condemnation going, but meditate on that. So you shall not offer, verse 22 is where we're at. Sorry. Animals, let's count them. Blind, number 1. Or disabled, number 2. Now, some of your versions might lump some of these together, but my version is a a more literal translation. It's not a transliteration where we kind of, it's like some versions even say any animal that's got a problem you can't use, and it moves on. Okay, but there's a reason that they dissociate these. So blind, number 1. Disabled, number 2. Mutilated, number 3. Or having a discharge, number 4. Or an itch, number 5. Or scabs, number 6. You shall not offer to the Lord or give them to the Lord as a food offering on the altar. So it stops at 6, halfway there, right? You may present a bull or a lamb. You may present, a bull or a lamb that has a part too long, there's number 7, or too short, a freewill offering, okay? But for a vow offering, it cannot be accepted. So too long or too short is not good for a vow. It's fine for a free will. In other words, just what I got done talking about, your own efforts, they can be fraught with problems. That's fine, because that's not what saves you, okay? But for a vow offering, in other words, this sacred covenant between the two of us, it's got to be perfect. And which means you can't do it. I'm going to have to do it for you through Jesus. So we're at 8, right? Verse 24, any animal that has its testicles bruised or crushed or torn or cut. That's 12. You shall not offer to the Lord, and you shall not do it within your land. Neither shall you offer as the bread of your God any such animal gotten from a foreigner. In other words, if you bought this from a Moabite and they have done these things to these animals or had a problem, you can't say, well, I didn't do it. You can't point the blame to someone else. It's not fit, since there is a blemish in them. Because of their mutilation, they will not be accepted for you. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when an ox or sheep or goat is born, it shall remain 7 days with its mother, and on the 8th day it shall be acceptable as a food offering to the Lord. But you shall not kill an ox or a sheep. And her young, I've lost my place all of a sudden. And her young in 1 day. Now, what's the importance of that? On one hand, I think it's just cruel to rip a baby out of it. Well, why is 8 days better than 7? I don't know exactly that. I'm not a farm guy. I don't know how long it takes for animals to be, sort of not cared about by their mothers, but I'm sure it's a little longer than 8 days. For them to be weaned. It might be different for each animal, right? Like an elephant, boy.
She'll look for her baby for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
I would imagine. So that's why I say you got to lean away from the whole emotional interpretation and look at the image, the ritual application here. That there's a reason, I think, why it uses the 7 days. That's the day of rest, right? And day 8 is a day of new beginnings. It's a start over. How many souls were on the ark? 8. And it was a new beginning for everybody on the ark. And so this number 8 speaks of starting over. It's fresh. It's new. So I think that's more of the implication there, is that don't use it right away. Wait until the next cycle. And when you sacrifice the sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord, you shall sacrifice it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten on the same day. You shall leave none of it until morning. I am the Lord. Now this one, I could be wrong, but what that speaks to me is an offering of thanksgiving, which is basically worship. You're coming to offer thanks to God for something He's done. And that meal that is there, you were supposed to basically, we read that way earlier in Leviticus, probably even before quarantine, that these were meals that were meant to promote fellowship between you and God. Some of it was set apart for God, some of it was for you. And so you're both mealing on the same sacrifice. And so this Thanksgiving offering was one of those. And so you shall sacrifice it so that you may be accepted, but you got to eat it that day. Why? Any ideas?
Because of
Well, that would be more of a practical thing, but let's look at the image that it might promote in your head. Why was it important, if you're going to do an act of worship, that it be for that day and not the next day?
because God commanded.
Well, yes, he did. but why do you think that's important to him?
Because you're doing what he told you to do.
Well, yeah, that's why it should be important. What if I told you you could be a Sunday saint and not worry about Monday? And you could, it's very important. How many people have said, well, I can't tell this joke in church. You're like, well, maybe you shouldn't tell that joke. Right? And this idea that we want to say, well, I went and I worshiped and I gave thanks. I should be good for a while, right? And he's saying, no, that's that day. You need to come back again the next day and do the same thing. Does that mean you have to go through the whole thing of going to church? No, it's like each day is a gift from God, and each day is a day for you to be set apart for worship. Each day. And I think that's a little bit about what he's saying there, is that don't save it for the next day. That was for that day's worship. How are you going to worship me today? And for us to have him ever present on our minds and on our hearts, not resting on our laurels, but what can I do today? And I was watching CBS News last night. Had a story about a kid with Down syndrome who is now the first Down syndrome kid who's won the Ironman. And his motto is 1% better. 1% better. And it's not, again, we have to be careful, and because it's like a tightrope, it's 1% better, knowing that it is only by grace that I can do that, but I'm not going to rest on, well, I did good yesterday, so I'm fine. I got to do good today, but I also have to do good today in him, in his strength. So 1% better in him, and not 1% better in the flesh or in our own strength, but in him. So you shall keep my commandments and do them, verse 31. I am the Lord, and you shall not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified among the people of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. There's that phrase again. I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Where does our sanctification come from? Jesus, right? Who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I brought you out for this reason. Not so that you could just not be in slavery anymore. Not so that you could go chasing after your lesser gods. Not so that you could, just offer me lip service. But I did this so that I could be your God. So that I could be your Lord. So that we could have this everlasting covenant between us. And of course, the entire Old Testament is about that. The fact that and I believe what God did was he chose the most stubborn, obstinate people he could find in Israel. I mean, look at Jacob. He was a cheat. He wasn't a manly man. He sent his wife and kids ahead, when he was meeting his brother, and that was his character. And God's like, I'm going to break that one, and I'm going to humble him, and I'm going to that's for my name's sake. And isn't that what Abraham said to God? For your name's sake, would you do this? And so who's going to get all of the glory here? God. And so he picked the most obstinate, stubborn. How many times the scripture says Israel is a stiff-necked people? They don't listen. They don't do what I say. And yet this is the people group that he has chosen. And so think about that next time you feel called by God. Is it because he saw something, that one I can work with? Or is it because that one's a challenge? I'm going to use that one because I'm going to get all the glory here. you know. And isn't that been true when you hear about people's stories? It's like, and it's the people that we tend to write off, that when God gets a hold of them, you know. I think that about Miley Cyrus. I think, boy, that girl, she's just nothing but trouble, and she just is her own worst enemy. But boy, if God ever got a hold of her, what influence she would have. Girl can sing, girl can write songs. I mean, she's just so gifted. Boy, if he could get a hold of her, it would what would that do to her sphere of influence, her circle of friends? You know, who could she reach? And that's why I pray for Miley. You know, I'm just like, boy, that would be so awesome. I think of, you know, your rockers and stuff. I think of Ozzy Osbourne. You know, I'm like, boy, what could happen if God got hold of Ozzy?
Wow.
You know,
Oh, yeah.
and cured him of some of his drug-induced injury. You know, boy, you know, and it's like, I think those are the places where God seeks to work, and we're so busy about saying, have I done good enough for you to work in me? You know, and I'm not saying that we should, you know, even Paul says that, should I sin so the grace may increase? No, no. But don't let the fact that there's darkness there count God out, because he loves to light up the darkness. It's where he does his best work. He goes into the darkest, dankest places and says, beauty, you know, beauty for ashes. I'm going to bring light to the darkness. The human race, you know, it's like the preamble to the Gospel of John. The light came to dwell among us, you know, and that light was the light. And then the darkness didn't understand it, couldn't conquer it, because it was light. And darkness doesn't conquer light. Light conquers darkness. So don't let you know, when you see those characters, Kanye West, you know, is he still full of himself? Absolutely, you know. But if you have yet to listen to any of his Jesus album, oh my goodness, there's gold on there. There's gold. There's some flesh too. He gets a little whiny in some of his songs about how people treat him, you know. But there's one where he's just like, Jesus, 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 Jesus. I mean, it's all about glorifying God. I'm like, that can't be all bad, you know. And who's listening to that never would have heard it? Because they're never going to listen to Caleb, right? But if Kanye drops a new album, they're going to go get it, right? And they just heard the gospel, you know. And it's like, wow, that's good. So they may not turn into Billy Graham, you know. But if God gets a hold of people like that and starts to use them, have some grace for them and understand that they're not going to be perfect little, you know, images of Christianity like we think we have to be on a Sunday morning. They're going to come with all of those issues that they brought into the kingdom, and then God's going to slowly but surely clean them and sanctify them through that stuff. That I don't believe that God called Kanye into the kingdom to say, hey, you've got to change everything overnight, because if you don't, then you're out. He's like, I've called you. I am going to call you to change, but I'm going to work that change in you, just like he does with us. You know, the tyranny of perfection is not what he calls us to, but we can get caught up in that when we read Leviticus. We can think, well, God only accepts what is perfect. And he does. Yet what he's saying is, this is a sacrifice for you, not by you, but for you. And we need to understand that when he's talking about Jesus, this is what Jesus did for us, not through us, but for us. And so our relationship with God is all through Christ. Questions, comments, queries? I guess that's the same as a question, isn't it? Grammar. Yes, it is. Quips, qualms. I don't have any other cue words. I'm not turning it off. If you got a question, you got it. It's funny. These ladies talk so much until I turn the camera on, and then there's like. So anyway, all right. I'll see you guys next week.